Hello, this is David Panush of the Edmund Burke School, and this is a supplemental video lecture for Chapter 2 from The Moral Animal by Robert Wright in Social Psychology. And again, just a reminder, this is only to supplement your reading. You need to do the reading in order to fully understand the concepts and answer the questions. To begin with, let's talk about this simple concept that is really important to our course and we'll work on more in class. The biological agenda is to survive and reproduce, as you recall. But how does it actually happen? I mean, in other words, why do we behave the way we behave? And the answer is emotions. We're driven by our emotions to act in ways that encourage our survival and encourage our ability to reproduce. We don't walk around all day saying, I must survive and reproduce. We walk around all day feeling hungry or feeling horny or feeling scared. And those are the emotions that cause us to behave in ways that result in us surviving and reproducing. Another important piece of this is that emotions happen very often below the level of consciousness. So we may not be aware that we're having these emotions. We know that we're behaving a certain way, but we're not always aware of that the emotions are actually driving it. So part of what we're going to do is actually spend some time trying to be more aware, more cognizant of the emotions that you all are having throughout the day and how they actually affect your behavior. When we think about, we're trying to understand why we have the mental capacities that we do, one thing we want to think about is very important to understand that the environment in which human beings did most of their evolving is extremely different than the one in which we live now. So you could say, look, if our only drive is to survive and reproduce, why would anyone wear a condom? Well, they didn't have condoms in the environment in which we evolved. We now can make choices that seem to contradict our biological agenda, but that's the gift of being human beings. It's also the gift of living in a time and an environment very different from the one in which we evolved. But if we want to understand why we think and feel and act the way we do, we need to understand what the environment was like in which those thinkings and feelings and behaviors would have been evolutionarily advantageous. So keep in mind that in the evolutionary environment there are very small groups of closely related people. You would very rarely encounter strangers. Almost everybody above puberty would be married, generally monogamous marriages, but sometimes polygamous in the sense that usually you'd have multiple females to a male, but very different than the environment in which we live now, and that's the important concept to understand. I want to introduce something that isn't in the book, but is really important when we talk about a trait that we say, generally speaking, and that's a very important word to keep in mind. We say, generally speaking, men are blank, or women are blank, or even human beings are blank. And what we mean by that is that there's a huge distribution throughout the population of people who have this trait, but in varying degrees. So we talked at the beginning about the knobs. People have it set at different ways, and most people have it set somewhere in the middle, and then we see some smaller numbers of people on the edges. This graphical representation is called the normal curve, and what you see is a huge bunch of population. You see number of people there on the left. The number of people goes up in the middle of the curve. So this is a graph for height. We see that most men are somewhere in the range of 170 centimeters to 185 centimeters, but we've got very, very few men as you go out to the edges of the curve who are really, really, really tall or really, really, really short. Similar with females, although it's a slightly narrower curve and more women are grouped around the middle, the population distribution is really very, very similar. And anytime we see any quality, whether it's something physical like height, or perhaps something mental like ambition, or guilt, there's going to be a normal distribution of people in the sense of where their knobs are set to how they feel it. Most people in the middle and then outliers along the edges. Now here's the important thing when we talk about sex differences. It doesn't mean that all men are taller than all women. So look at the two curves. We understand that the female curve is shifted down so that most women are shorter than most men. But not all women are shorter than all men. Where the curves cross, around 170 centimeters, you've got a population of women who are taller than a certain population of men. And the same can go with any other quality we come up with. So if we say men are on average or generally speaking taller than women, we don't mean every man is taller than every woman. There will be exceptions, and many exceptions, and when we say that, you say, oh, well, somebody is taller than somebody else. It doesn't refute the idea that, generally speaking, men are taller than women. All right, so here's where we start to apply that idea of the distribution within a population. Generally speaking, Robert Wright is going to argue that because of biology, males are more eager for sex and females are more choosy for sex. So they're going to be less eager and more picky, and they're going to take their time more, whereas a male will be less picky and isn't as interested in taking his time. In general, it doesn't mean if we draw the two graphs, we won't find that there are some women, some females who are more eager and less choosy than some males. So why is it that we would see this biologically? The basic answer is that males' investment in offspring is very close to zero. And when I say investment, I mean the time it takes or the calories it takes. A male produces millions and millions of sperm, whereas females, if they're having offspring, their investment is much greater than zero. Females only have, I'm going to get the number wrong, but I'm going to say something like 40 or 50 eggs total, maybe less, from the time they're born. So every time, I got the number very, very wrong. So strike that number, but it's a finite number of eggs. It's enough eggs to have about one period throughout from puberty to menopause. So I'd have to do the math to figure that out. But anyways, a lot more than 40 or 50. But the point is, it's a finite number. Millions of sperm, finite number of eggs. So we know that females simply have to invest more biologically even to make eggs. Being pregnant is incredibly costly on a female's body. Breastfeeding, incredibly costly on the female body. Caring for babies after they're born, generally speaking, in our evolutionary environment, the females would do more of that. It's costly for females. So, because the cost of having sex and reproducing is so much greater for females, and they can only do it maybe 20 times in their life if they're amazingly productive, whereas a man could do it thousands of times, you know, females should be more careful about investing their precious reproductive resources, and therefore they should be more choosy about how often they have sex and with whom they have sex. So generally speaking, males will try to have as much sex as possible. There's an experiment with fruit flies in 1948 that proved this, at least for fruit flies. We're not fruit flies, but we know that there's a lot of other data that seems to suggest that males are much more interested in having sex with no strings attached. They're much more easily aroused. They're much more willing to engage in anonymous sex. So generally the females should have sex only when it makes sense. They should choose carefully. And again, these traits are distributed within a population. So you will have some females who are more eager than some females, and of course some females who are more eager than some females, and some males who aren't that eager, and some males who are very eager. But most people will fall in the middle of those curves, and most males will be more eager than most females. So given this disparity, the male who's trying to have sex is going to advertise to the female. The female, on the other hand, because she has limited resources, is going to trying to assess the male's advertisement. So the male advertises, the female assesses, should this be the guy? So here's the thing, it's evolution. So a male that is really successful at advertising will probably reproduce more, and we should see more males who are successful at advertising in the next generation. A female that is not good at spotting liars, because the males are going to make themselves appear to be better than they are, she's going to end up having less successful offspring because the males maybe lied about how great they were. And so we should expect to see females get better and better in each generation at spotting the liars. We should also expect them to sort of be raising the stakes and raising the bar. So it's an evolutionary arms race where the males evolved to be better at hiding their flaws and the females evolved to be better at spotting the flaws and spotting the liars. This goes back to the concept we talked about. Evolution for human beings is largely an adaptation to each other. Parental investment, we've sort of been hinting at it already, but it was defined in 1972 by Robert Trivers. Any investment by the parent in an individual offspring that increases the offspring's chances of survival, and hence the offspring's chances of reproduction, at the cost of the parent's ability to invest in other offspring. So anytime a woman is pregnant or breastfeeding or caring for one child, she can't be caring for another. Anytime a male has one kid in his hand, he might not be able to be doing anything for the other kids. So that's an investment in children. We know that females invest more than males, both before birth and after. And Robert Trivers' theory goes, in any species, when we see a differential between male and female parental investment, we can explain some of the differences in the eagerness between the sexes, the choosiness, who does the selection, how courtship goes, who takes more of a part in parenthood, fidelity and infidelity, etc. And the book goes into some examples in other species that show this. Finally, we ask, okay, this is all great in theory, but how do we prove it? And this discussion in the book is quite, intense and involved, so you should take a look at it. I've boiled it down. When we can find a trait or a characteristic that seems to be universal, seems to be happening everywhere, that's one. Two, we can't explain this by culture alone, in part because we see the trait in so many different cultures that are so different from one another and have different values and different ways of doing things, yet we still see the trait. That means that it's probably not going to be based on culture. Three, let's look at our closest animal relatives, and for us it's primates, chimps, gorillas, bonobos, and orangutans. They're the closest ones to us evolutionarily. Let's look at them. Do they behave in ways that we would expect them to behave given the same kinds of behaviors or same kinds of traits that we see in ourselves? What does it suggest? And if it suggests that that works for us too, that tells us a lot that it might have an evolutionary basis. And finally, any time in science or any time in history or social science, when we have a theory that is both simple and elegant, it's not very complicated, and explains the data, and explains lots and lots of data in lots of different ways, chances are it's the right theory. And this is called the principle of Occam's razor. Generally speaking, the simplest, most direct explanation for something is the correct explanation for something. So when we're trying to say, well, okay, I see this thing, but is it evolutionary? Is it biological? Well, let's look. Can we explain it by culture in every single time we see it? What if we look at other species, especially the ones that are closest to us? And is it simply explained, or do we have to, can it explain the data if we explain it that way? So I hope that this helps supplement your reading, and please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to come and see me.